In many ways, George III's reign was the dawn of modern Britain. After those dark days of Jacobite rebellion, the Hanoverians were at their peak, and step by step, things were getting brighter. Although, of course, life was still an uphill struggle for most of us.
Well, this is Eccles Pike. It's a hill just above Chapel-in-the-Frith, which is just down the road from Castleton, where, of course, the Garland ceremony takes place. Now, I came here very early on May Day morning to see what I believed was an equally ancient traditional ceremony.
We've been dancing on Eccles Pike now for 25 years. Morris dancers across the country have been doing it for hundreds of years, welcoming in the summer. Our first year was in 1993, when I suggested, having danced with other clubs around the country on the 1st of May, that we came to Eccles Pike and danced to welcome in the sun and the summer. It's a traditional thing to do. It's been done for hundreds of years around the country, and as far as we know, it's going to continue on.
So it seems that starting a new tradition can be fairly straightforward, especially if you're copying something that's been tried and tested elsewhere. And it's dawning on me that something very similar could well have happened 200 years ago here in Castleton, when the bell ringers at St Edmund's Church copied bits and pieces from what was happening elsewhere and changed what had been their traditional May Day parade into what we now call the Castleton Garland ceremony. And the evidence for this, which admittedly is all circumstantial, points to it happening in the reign of George III. Now, you can read about this period in any number of history books or academic papers, but I've found a Penguin paperback by Steve Roud called The English Year to be a treasure trove of information about the nation's calendar customs, and that includes the Castleton Garland ceremony. Now, we know that by the end of the 18th century, many of the old May Day and Whitsun celebrations had been moved to May the 29th. This trend started back in the 17th century, but moving the May Day celebrations back to May the 29th would have been encouraged, to say the least, by what happened in 1752. The old Julian calendar, which Britain had followed up until then, had too many leap years, so it got out of step with the seasons, like a clock that had been running slow for hundreds of years. Correcting it had the effect of bringing everything forward by 11 days. So, from 1753 onwards, May Day has fallen in what had previously been the middle of April, which of course was problematic for garland makers. Now, in 1760, George III came to the throne, and because his birthday was June the 4th, the May the 29th holiday sort of became associated with him rather than the long-forgotten Jacobite rebels. In 1761, an Oxfordshire clergyman noted in his diary that on May the 29th, many of the local cottages had been decorated with boughs of oak. And in the 1780s, Lord Torrington wrote that on May the 29th, every carter's horse is adorned with oak. So it seems that oak was now associated with support for king and country, just like the festivities on May the 29th, which always had been known as Restoration Day up until this period, when people suddenly started calling it either Oak Apple Day or Royal Oak Day. Now, I haven't been able to find out exactly when and why the name change occurred, but it's interesting to note that the schoolboy practice of nettling those people who weren't wearing oak was often accompanied by party political name calling. The medieval practice of decking houses with branches had been to ward off evil spirits, but this revival was more in the spirit of putting up bunting and showing the flag. It extended to roofs and even church towers, as it still does in St Neot in Cornwall. And of course, St Edmund's Church gets similar treatment in Castleton. But as well as branches, the garland gets put on the central pinnacle after it's hoisted up from the king's shoulders on what used to be the finale of the ceremony. The strange and unique form of Castleton's garland makes more sense when you see it in the context of 18th century May Day parades. In medieval times, garlands were made to bring into church, but in the 18th century they were also being taken from door to door by tradesmen with the aim of collecting pennies. In Abbotsbury, the children still did this with their garlands until, as we heard, their tradition ended in 2013. Now, back to the 18th century, and Roy Judge, the folklore historian, did a lot of research into these tradespeople's parades, May Day parades in this period, and he discovered that the milkmaids used to build their garlands around their shiny pails and plate, and so their garlands had to be carried by a porter, which left the milkmaids free to dance for pennies. But the chimney sweeps went one better, with what became known as a Jack in the Green. This term was coined in the late 18th century, and it referred to a man, invariably a sweep's apprentice, not carrying but wearing a framework of greenery to become a garland that could walk and dance by itself, to entertain the crowds and raise money to see the sweeps through their lean summer season. And because it was successful, it was copied, and you can still see this Victorian version of a Jack in the Green in the Royal Knutsford May Day Parade, not too far away in Cheshire. Further south, in Deptford and Hastings for example, there are modern festivals which feature revivals of 18th century Jack in the Greens, although you'll also see green men there. Now, green men are ancient mythical symbols of verdant fertility, and they crop up in medieval churches, so they're nothing to do with Jack in the Green, which was the name given to the chimney sweep's 18th century dancing garland. And in the same way that Knutsford copied the idea, the Castleton ringers could have been inspired to go one better and change their traditional May Day garland, which could have been like these modern day ones that are still made in Oxfordshire, into a man-sized, bell-shaped money spinner to top the bill in the Castleton May Day Parade. The weight of the frame and the foliage would have meant that the bell ringer who wore it certainly wouldn't be able to dance. That would be left to his colleagues, and he'd need to ride through the village on horseback, like the old Whitsuntide Lord of Misrule probably did. Here in Castleton, that character, with his pantomime dame of a wife, appear to have been subsumed into the garland ceremony. But elsewhere, such as here in Kilburn in Yorkshire, those traditional characters have survived as a mock mayor and his comedy mayoress.
To the cart!
And they tour the village in a cart, make speeches,
I have been the Lord Mayor of Kilburn for 1 year and 1 day! Beer! Free beer!
And organise free drinks at the village pub. Taken all together, that's not so different to the garland ceremony, although of course Castleton has more pubs, as well as music and dancing, and of course a unique large garland. Traditional small May Day garlands used to end up displayed in church, as they still are in Charlton on Otmore, but the ringer's new garland would have been too big for that. However, thanks to the revival of decking,
Try that for size.
they could still show that they were top dogs in Castleton because the church bell tower was the tallest building in the village. So, when they decorated it with greenery and their special bell-shaped garland, they were clearly showing that they were second to none when it came to flying the flag for king and country.
So, in every way it seems, the ringers would have eclipsed all their rivals from the old May Day ceremony. But it appears that they may well have retained a symbolic reminder of the old May Queen, in the form of the Queen Posy, that still sits in pride of place on top of the garland. Addy also wanted to know about the garland tune's origin, so he consulted his colleague Frank Kidson, a musicologist, who pointed out that it was a popular regional Morris tune based on a country dance that was first published in the 1750s. So there you are, several pieces of admittedly circumstantial evidence that point to the fact that the Garland ceremony was a product of the late 18th century, and that it was as much a salute to the good times of George III as it was to the merry old days of Charles II.
We know from Addy's conversations with Castleton's elders that the Garland ceremony didn't change much during the early and middle years of Victoria's reign. But in the 1890s, the railway finally reached this previously remote part of the Peak District.
And in 1894, the passenger trains of the Midland Railway began steaming through the Hunt Valley. Nowadays, there's still a good service of regional express trains on this line, but the only ones that stop are these elderly sprinters which rattle their weary way between Manchester and Sheffield, calling at Edale, Bamford, Hathersage, Grindleford and here at Hope. And on summer weekends they also bring small groups of ramblers and hikers here into the Hope Valley. But the vast majority of visitors come by road, so nowadays the station's often deserted. But back in the 1890s, when Hope Station had waiting rooms and porters, it was a major destination for day excursions from all of the surrounding conurbations. And so when this station opened, the number of visitors coming to Castleton rocketed. Previously, to get there, you either had to walk or else come by horse, and that meant that although the place was popular, visitors were numbered by the dozen. From the summer of 1894 onwards, excursion trains brought them by the thousand.
The local reporters from the regional papers
In Derbyshire and Sheffield,
got to the Hope Valley long before the railway did, but the earliest mention of the Garland ceremony that we've found so far is actually a reader's letter that appears in the Buxton Advertiser in 1869. And finding that information was made so much easier now that the British Library have made it possible to search their national newspaper archive online. Now, the local newspapers started carrying reports of the Garland ceremony from the 1870s onwards, and that led to ill-informed items in the notes and queries columns, as well as the reports themselves that linked the Garland ceremony on May the 29th to Charles II.
Now, this even spread to Castleton because obviously there was nobody in the village who was old enough to remember the true origins of the ceremony. So in the 1880s, we see the chap who carried the garland starting to be called the Garland King. And in the mid-1890s, the pressure to change the ceremony into a celebration of Charles II hiding in a tree increased to meet the expectations of the trainloads of visitors from the nearby towns. As it happened, 1897 was Diamond Jubilee year, and in that spirit, the Garland got a bit of a makeover.
So, the Garland King got a new regal costume,
and the ceremony got a revamp with village girls doing a new dance to the old tune. The pantomime dame character got a coronet to wear under his/her veil, and the role became more like that of a courtier.
and the man who led the king's horse no longer carried a besom brush.
The besom, with its pagan powers to cleanse and purify, was traditionally carried at the front of village parades, but in Castleton its role had really become one of sweeping spectators out of the way outside each pub to create a space where the men could dance. Now, after 1897, the girls danced in an area that was created and protected by their parents, so the besom was no longer required.
At Ramwick, near Stroud, their mock mare ceremony, which was revived in 1972, takes place at the village water troughs, so it's not surprising that their besom has become a mop, and it's still used as a means of crowd control.
Anyway, in Castleton, by the time of Addy's report in 1901, both the besom and the men's dance had become things of the past.
But fortunately for us, Edwin Barber, who was one of the last dancing ringers, met up with Cecil Sharp when he was collecting local dances in 1912 for his definitive work, The Morris Book. And this snapshot of the men's old dance has been recreated for us by Jed Morton of the Chapel Morris Men. As you can see, the men's dance was rustic, but it didn't have the charm of the girls' version, which not only fitted the Charles II scenario, but also gave the railway visitors what they were looking for, a journey back in time to an idyllic, rose-coloured, pre-industrial, rural way of life.
So, whoever took the old dance, reworked it and taught it to the girls, did a great job.
And Kay Harrison from the Castleton Historical Society, who's been researching these and other aspects of the Garland ceremony, has taken a break from the archives to visit the Bull's Head on Cross Street to talk about that change to mine hosts Michelle and Pete.
Now the question is, who was the first dance mistress? Now most people think that it was actually Ivy Johnson standing here. She was from the Peak Hotel, very musical family, but she would have only been 8 years old in 1897, so not likely to have been her. We found some interviews with some elderly residents in the 1960s who were actually children round about the turn of the century, and they said that it was a Miss Partington that used to first teach the dancing. And we found out that she was called Annie Partington. She was a music teacher and she lived here at the Bull's Head, and she was a daughter-in-law of the landlady. This photograph was taken in either 1897 or 1898, and we think that Miss Partington is the lady standing there right in the middle. This was taken to celebrate the change from the men to the children.
That's the first year they've had children?
Yes, we think it's actually the oldest photograph that there is of the Garland ceremony. So the children's dance that you see today actually was created right here in this pub, and it's still going on today.
Annie and her family moved to Lancashire to run another pub, and her role in the survival of the Garland ceremony was almost forgotten. But she's still remembered by her surviving grandson as a noted pianist, who, he believes, once played for Queen Victoria. But even so, I think that in those days it's unlikely that a woman could have been the driving force behind such a major change in a male-dominated hierarchy like the Garland Committee. However, Kay's researchers have come up with a much more likely candidate.
Henry Bowman Shepherd. He became the village doctor in 1896. He was a big man, and for the next 30 years he played a big part in village life. And it was for him that the Garland procession made this extra stop at what is still called Doctor's Corner.
All the other stops are outside the village's 6 pubs, where all those in the procession get a liquid reward.
Orange juice!
But this stop's different. It's on the corner of Back Street, next to what used to be the doctor's house.
Back in his day, this wall had a gate in it that led into Dr. Shepherd's garden.
From his gate, he got a grandstand view of the dancing. Now, the question is, did this amount to VIP treatment for bringing this new look to the ceremony?
Dr. Shepherd retired in 1924, but his successor, Dr. Bailey, continued to get the same special treatment until he retired in 1962.
Later, the gateway was walled up. The surgery moved to Hope, and for a few years, to help keep traffic flowing, the procession didn't stop there.
But in 1990, the Garland Committee decided that this stop had become part of the tradition, so they still dance at Doctor's Corner.
And an earlier incumbent, John Winterbottom, who was the medical officer and public vaccinator for Castleton for over 40 years, also had a connection with the Garland story.
That's right. His coachman, George Watts, is the earliest Garland king whose name we know, and he retired from that role when his master died in 1870. He then handed on his old livery coat, which he wore for the ceremony, to his successor, Thomas Hall. That old coat continued to do service until 1897, when the ceremony took on its new look, with girl dancers and a smart new ceremonial jacket for the Garland king. Comparing the two coats, you can see that the old one has a folksy look with homemade rosettes, whereas the replacement has definitely got regal pretensions to go with what by then had become the belief that the Garland king was the personification of Charles II.
Now, I think that in 1897, the Garland Committee bought this new costume, which Kay was able to try on recently when it came back to Castleton, because the Royal Jubilee created the right atmosphere for a new broom like Dr. Shepherd, who later became their chairman, to persuade the ringers to sweep aside the old story of a May Day Jack in the Green, which most people had long forgotten about anyway, in favour of a new narrative that the ceremony was all about a king hiding in a tree.
Now, as it happened, those changes from a jack to a king and from Morris to maiden dancing gave the ceremony a stronger connection with the local community, if only because the dancing girls all had proud parents. And so, consequently, in the late 1890s, the Garland ceremony got a new lease of life.
And the story of how the Garland ceremony survived the upheavals of the 20th century and made it into the 21st follows in part 3.